Hello, everybody. My name is Doug Soldat, and today we're going to be talking. Last week we talked about how to interpret a soil test report, and as part of that interpretation comes recommendations. And so today we're going to be talking about some of the details of behind those recommendations. So boosting your garden soil with amendments. And the primary soil amendments, there are many types of soil amendments. So the primary ones that we're going to talk about today are lime. And then sulfur. So lime is used to increase soil pH. Sulfur is the opposite. It's used to decrease soil pH. Fertilizer, used to adjust nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium availability to a plant. And then compost improves the soil physical properties, but also the nutrient availability, the organic matter content. So very versatile soil amendment there. All right, let's talk about liming first. Liming, when you need lime. So soil test report will tell you if you need lime or not. And if you need it, it's going to improve the soil structure. It will improve organic matter because it improves the life in the soil. It can reduce toxicities of certain elements. It can increase the availability of other nutrients. It can increase the ability of the soil to hold nutrients in general, which is great. Will improve the plant's growth, improve the microbial activity, and can influence the severity of various diseases. So when we're talking about lime, we're typically talking about, in general, a chemical called calcium carbonate, which is the same thing eggshells are made out of. And it is a material that will neutralize acidity. And there are many different materials that can be used to raise the pH, known as lime. And this table is just showing that, some of them will contain magnesium. So in Wisconsin, it's fairly common for our lime sources to be either dolomitic limestone or dolomite, which you can see is calcium magnesium carbonate. So almost the same, but it has the kind of added benefit of having some magnesium, which is a plant nutrient. You can see that there's a whole bunch of different, ground oyster shells. Eggshells is one that we talked about. And these have a calcium carbonate equivalent, and that's just a percentage. So the reference material is calcium carbonate, pure calcium carbonate. It's 100%. There, if you use an ag limestone, it's going to be 80 to 100% CCE, which means you'll probably want to add slightly more, maybe 20% more to get the same neutralizing power as pure calcium carbonate. And that just accounts for the fact that there's some impurities in the limestone, things that aren't just lime. They're not going to hurt anything, but they're just not going to neutralize the acidity. So nothing important or to something that you have to memorize here, but just kind of showing you that a lot of these materials, if you look at the chemical composition, calcium carbonate, calcium carbonate, calcium carbonate. So a lot of these are forms of calcium carbonate or calcium oxides. So when you're looking at a liming material, we just talked about the purity of it being represented by this CCE or calcium carbonate equivalent. That'll be right on the label. It'll tell you what the CCE is. And so if you need 1 pound, if your soil test says you need 1 pound of lime and your purity is 50%, then you'd actually need to apply 2 pounds of that material. Or if you have basically, you take the amount on the soil test report and you divide it by your CCE. So, for example, let's say that a CCE of 80%, 1 divided by 0.8 is 1.25. So you'd add 1.25 pounds of a material with a CCE of 80%. Now, the other aspect is how fine the material is, the fineness of the particle size, and they report that typically as a mesh size. And the bigger the mesh size, the smaller the particle size. So I'll show you an example of that here. With this is ag lime, so pure calcium carbonate is going to be like white, and you can see that this is ag lime, which is mostly calcium carbonate, but it has some impurities in it. It gives it that kind of brownish or orangish color. And you can see that a 4 mesh looks like pea gravel, and that's going to react very slowly and not be a very good choice. Whereas the 100 mesh on the right is like a very fine powder. So in terms of which will react quicker, you could imagine if you're trying to dissolve this in a cup of water, that the very fine stuff will dissolve faster, which is true. So the smaller the size, the faster it'll dissolve or react. But which will be easier to apply? And your answer to that is probably going to be closer to the coarser stuff, because the powder will kind of blow everywhere and be kind of messy and difficult to handle. So it's considerations that you need to apply. I think the 20 mesh here looks pretty good to me. It's a nice combination of fine particle size, but larger particle sizes that are going to be a little bit easier to handle. So you'll see a variety of sizes, and just know that the smaller the size, the faster the reaction will be. Now, speaking of reaction times, it's actually kind of slow. So here is years of cropping shown on the y-axis or the x-axis here, and then here's the soil pH. So let's say we have a pH of about 4.5. We apply some limestone, and it increases, but it increases, I would say, relatively slowly over like a year and a half period. It starts to peak here, maybe after a year, and then it'll slowly start to decrease until we maybe get to the point where we're starting to see some negative impacts on our crop growth. And we'll make that application again just at year 4, maybe in the spring of year 4. And we see that after that application, we really don't see a peak in our pH until the spring of year 5. So it takes about a year for that lime to fully affect your pH. And then you can see that it also takes several years for the pH to slowly decrease. And now you ask, well, why is it decreasing? Why does soil pH go down? There's a variety of reasons for it, but one of the most common explanation is that most of your fertilizers, your nitrogen fertilizers, are acidifying. So this shows you how much calcium carbonate equivalent you need to apply to neutralize the acidity that's applied from applying different nitrogen fertilizers. So ammonium sulfate's at the top of the list. That's the most acidifying fertilizer. If you apply 1 pound of ammonium sulfate, or 1 pound of nitrogen from the ammonium sulfate, you'll need to apply 5.4 pounds of calcium carbonate or lime equivalent. And then you go down the line here: mono ammonium phosphate, diammonium phosphate, sulfur-coated urea, the ureas, even natural organic fertilizers. For every 1.7 pounds of nitrogen you apply from a natural organic fertilizer, you'll need to apply, I'm sorry, for every 1 pound of nitrogen you apply from a natural organic fertilizer, you have to apply almost 2 pounds of lime to offset that acidity. So fertilization is an acidifying process. So let's talk about the other side of this. Now, let's say your pH is too high for the crop you're trying to grow. How do you lower pH? There's a couple ways you can do it, but the main way that I recommend is elemental sulfur. And it is suitable for most crops. It also is a slow process. So it relies on microbes to break the sulfur down into sulfate. And so that means that if you make an application in fall, nothing is going to happen by spring, because soil microbes aren't doing much work. There's not much activity when the soil temperatures are low. So a lot of the change in pH will happen over the summer. Again, it's a slow process. It won't happen overnight. But the application rates depend on things that are difficult to know for sure on a soil test. So you will never see a recommendation for how much sulfur to add on a soil test report. It's something that you just sort of have to experiment with and play with. So on the table on the right here, which is from this Ohio State University fact sheet, it says the rate of elemental sulfur required to decrease soil pH to a depth of 6 inches in 3 different soil types: sand, silt loam, and clay. And then it's giving you the numbers you see there are in pounds of sulfur per acre. So, that's a relatively large area. Maybe you're dealing with square feet. So you'd have to convert from acres to square feet. And the desired change in pH. So if we're at an 8.5 and we want to get down to a 6.5, and we're on a sand, we might need about 370 pounds of sulfur per acre. But if we're on a clay, you can see that we're going to need almost 1,500 pounds per acre. Now, let's say we're at a 7 and we want to get down to a 6.5 on that clay. We could do that with about half the amount of sulfur. So that's this table's handy for kind of understanding what your current pH is, what your target pH is, and approximately how much lime you'd need to add, depending on soil type. But this is not always correct because the assumptions here uh, are that the soils are not calcareous. And that's not always true in Wisconsin soils. Some Wisconsin soils, especially in the east and parts of the south, are calcareous, which means that their particles are built out of limestone particles, and then these numbers will not be true. And in fact, it may be impossible to change the pH on a calcareous soil. So what I recommend you do is use the table like this as a guide, and then monitor your soil pH regularly after that application. And when I say regularly, I'm talking annually, and then adjust as needed. So, soil test in the fall, make your applications of sulfur in the spring, soil test again in the fall, maybe make another application in the spring until you reach a steady pH that you're happy with. So that's what elemental sulfur looks like here. It's yellow, really pretty product. Aluminum sulfate's another option that you'll sometimes see recommended, and the benefit is it reacts very quickly. So you don't have to wait on microbes. You can adjust your pH in cool temperatures. But aluminum sulfate's not ideal because it requires a lot more material, about 5 times as much material, and it can be toxic to plants. So if you misapply this product, you can actually you can harm plants. So there's certain situations where this might make sense, but overall, sulfur's safer. It's more efficient because you can make soil pH changes with less material. So that's why I like sulfur. Okay, so soil test, we're moving on to fertilizers now. Soil test results will also tell you how much fertilizer to add with specific amounts. The nitrogen fertilization is based on the type of crop you're growing and not necessarily anything on the soil test report. Generally, you want to avoid these kind of 10-10-10 or low-grade non-specific fertilizers because it doesn't match the plant need, and you may end up overdosing in phosphorus and potassium. Generally, we don't see a lot of need for micronutrients, and if you do see a need for micronutrients, it's likely because your pH is out of whack. So we recommend adjusting your pH to get it in the right range, and then applying the correct amount of phosphorus and potassium based on your soil test report. So let's talk about options for doing that. Organic fertilizers are great choices. They're made from organic materials, which means they're chemically complex. They're naturally occurring. They're byproducts. They also rely on microorganisms to degrade them, which means that they are slow release. They release the nutrients slowly at a variable rate, which depends on the temperature and the moisture variability. And over time, they can improve your soil structure because you're adding organic matter and you're adding carbon to the soil. Organic fertilizers come in a variety, and these are, literally hundreds and hundreds of different types. This is a handful of different organic fertilizers, showing that you can find ones that have relatively high nitrogen relative to the phosphorus and the potassium. So blood meal would be an example of that. If your soil test shows that you're low in phosphorus but high in potassium, a bone meal will be a relatively good choice. It's got low nitrogen, high phosphorus, and no potassium. Tree leaves are relatively low in nutrient content, and that makes sense because trees have sucked back all those valuable nutrients for use later, where the leaves are high in carbon, so they're relatively inert chemically. Green sand is an example of an organic fertilizer that's relatively high in potassium. And then activated biosolids, this is, or maybe similar to many manures, will have nitrogen, phosphorus, and relatively low amounts of potassium. So the questions here is, if you have a low phosphorus garden, we're going to go with bone meal. If you're going to try to apply mostly nitrogen, we're going to go but little phosphorus or potassium, we're going to go with the blood meal. And if we're going to contribute organic matter to the soil, but relatively little nutrients, tree leaves would be a good choice for that. Okay, inorganic fertilizers, they're made of mineral components, either synthesized or mined. Microorganism degradation is usually not required. So just like the aluminum sulfate, you can adjust the nutrient levels in cool soils in spring and fall. However, they come, just like the aluminum sulfate, with potential for damage if misused. However, there are many slow-release options available. So you can get some of the benefits of organic fertilizers in these inorganic fertilizers. Here's an example of a couple different bags. You can see that this one is monopotassium phosphate, and it has an analysis of 0, 52, 34. That's the N is the first number, the P is the second number, and the K is the third number. This bag also has those numbers. It's likely on the back. So by law, all fertilizers will have those 3 numbers on them. But some people do a different job of marketing. The old school way is to put the 3 numbers on the front of the bag in big bold letters. This is kind of the newer school way, is to kind of bury that information on the back. But all fertilizers will contain those 3 numbers. So here's some example of inorganic fertilizers. Miracle-Gro, which does a very good job of hiding these numbers. But if you look on the back of your Miracle-Gro package, and there's all kinds of versions of it, but a traditional version will have twice as much phosphorus as nitrogen and potassium. A general turf fertilizer, because of the phosphorus bans in the state of Wisconsin, is usually going to have a 0 as a middle number, and also very low potassium. Lawns require less potassium than other crops. Lawns have high nitrogen requirements. And so, excuse me, so lawn fertilizers are often great choices for crops that need high nitrogen but low other nutrients. They also sell, about this time, the shelves on the stores will stock what's called a winterizer fertilizer, and that's going to have, this will be 0 because of the phosphorus bands. But you can see now the potassium level is increased. There's an old belief that's not really true, that lawns need potassium in the fall. At least cool season lawns up here in Wisconsin, our research shows that's not true. But nonetheless, these fertilizers get sold. So if your soil test report says you need potassium, you can buy a winterizer turf fertilizer, which has more potassium. And then a starter fertilizer, phosphorus is really important for new seedlings and lawns. And that, you can see, looks exactly like the Miracle-Gro. If you look at the price of Miracle-Gro, price per pound, dollar per pound, versus the dollar per pound of this product, the starter turf fertilizer is going to be much, much less expensive, even though the contents are about the same. So phosphorus-free, the general lawn, or any lawn fertilizer. If you want to add potassium, you're looking for a winterizer fertilizer. And if you want to add organic matter, that's a trick question, because none of these have organic matter in them. All right, so applying fertilizer, you can broadcast it before planting and then till it into the soil, mix it into the soil. It's least likely to cause plant damage because there's no plants there. And this is a typical way for home gardeners to do it. You can also band or make row applications where you have plants growing. So the fertilizer is applied to the strip, maybe to the side of a row before planting. Before planting. And with this method, you don't want the roots to come into contact with the fertilizer band, which could kill the plants. And then side dressing is a method for fertilizing actively growing plants during the growing season, where you sort of broadcast and then water that into the soil. So, the applications, hopefully that, fairly simple. Apply it before planting, apply it at the time of seeding, but keep the fertilizer away from the direct area where you're planting the roots. And then side dressing is fertilizing on top. It's very similar to broadcasting, except you're not mixing it in. Okay, and then finally we'll wrap up here talking about organic matter. Organic matter is a wonderful solution for physical properties of soil. So if you have a clay soil that drains poorly, organic matter can help with aggregation. If you have a sandy soil that doesn't hold a lot of water, organic matter can act like a sponge and hold water, but it also provides nutrients. So big fan of organic matter addition to soils for gardening. And you can do that by composting. You can buy a commercial compost, a municipal compost. You can compost yourself. There's a variety of ways to do it and tons of University of Wisconsin extension resources on how to do that. Some advice on using compost: amend a site, don't amend a hole, okay? Because you're changing the properties. And when you change the properties, you change where the water goes. So it's best to amend the entire site, not just where you're planting. You want to use a lot of compost. So 25 to 50% by volume is a recommended amount if you're amending a soil. As you can see this person doing here is a bucket of compost being spread on this soil, and that's being mixed in. You want to work it in to a depth of 12 to 18 inches where your roots are going to be, and make sure that your soil can drain excess water, because this is going to it'll infiltrate water, it'll hold water, but you want to make sure it doesn't act like a bathtub or a teacup and hold that water. So make sure that you have adequate drainage at the bottom of that root zone or surface drainage to drain it away. So this is the teacup effect, where you maybe have a compacted clay soil, and then we dug out the soil, we amended it, we improved the properties, we dropped that tree in there, but the water's just going to sit like here in a teacup. So if this was the case, we'd want to make sure that we had maybe a French drain, or we had some way for that water to escape, so we don't just end up with a dead tree. So just the last couple slides here on a relatively poor soil that has not been amended. Here's 3 years later after planting without these amendments. Here's with compost added. And then here's the view from afar. So there's the non-amended, and then here is the amended. And you can see that it's growing tremendously better. So compost pH can do things like this. Picture could also be about pH. If the pH wasn't optimum on the left and the right, you could see reduced growth like that. Changing the pH could result in much better plant growth. So soil test, know your amendments, and good luck gardening. I think we'll stop there and open it up for questions.
Thanks, Doug, for that. And I have been dropping a few links into the chat. I make sure those are also linked up with our recording. After the program, we'd love to hear your feedback. So there is a link to the survey that will pop up when we end here. Lots of questions coming in. I'm sure people are very interested. Can you just go over again the timing? I know you mentioned with lime and sulfur, those things take a while. Fertilizer, I know you went through that, and with compost, but can you just kind of go over the timing of when to add amendments? What things could be maybe done now, and what things should we wait until spring?
Yeah, so the most important thing to wait for spring is going to be for nitrogen fertilizer, because nitrogen is transformed rapidly, and with snowfall and snowmelt and drainage, you can lose a lot of that. Phosphorus and potassium are safer to add now if you'd like. They bind to the soil. Most of that will be there in the spring. Same thing with the lime and the sulfur. Those can also be added now. Just understanding that with sulfur, very little, if anything, will happen, because the microbes won't be around to break it down. However, it also won't leach away in the drainage water. The lime, you can certainly amend it now. If you want to till into your garden, but you can also wait. So there's not a lot of reason to do any of these things heading into winter. You can for many of them, but spring will be a wonderful time to make all those amendments. So the only thing I would recommend you don't do is add nitrogen fertilizer to a garden in fall.
Great tips, thank you. I would just like to remind everyone to get your soil tested in order to know what recommendations to add, right? So your soil test will give you a report that gives you recommendations based on what you're trying to grow. So it's very specific to your site.
Yeah, can I tell a little story about that too?
Go for it.
So the do-it-yourself, or like a version of pH testing for farms, was invented at the University of Wisconsin by Emil Truog in I can't remember the exact year, let's say like 1918. And it was a set of instructions in a kit where you could figure out where your soil pH is. And wheat was a big crop back in those times, and Wisconsin farmers started doing this soil pH test, which would come with a lime recommendation, and they started amending their soils with lime and getting much higher wheat yields. Minnesota, right next door, was also growing a lot of wheat at that same time. Uh, they weren't aware, they weren't using the test, and they started to notice that Wisconsin farmers were outperforming them. And then they started purchasing this pH test, and then their yields kicked up. So you can actually look at like the Wisconsin or the U.S. Historical wheat yields, and you can see that effect. So getting your pH right will absolutely improve your yields and your productivity, but you don't know until you test it.
Right, and it is variable across the state. I know down here in southern Wisconsin, we have really heavy clay soils. Our pH is much higher than it's going to be in other areas, especially in the central sands and other areas of Wisconsin. So important to know what your baseline is and what you're dealing with before you start adding a bunch of stuff that may or may not be necessary. We've gotten a lot of questions, Doug, and this is probably where we'll wrap up the last couple of minutes, is about adding, natural or organic amendments. So grass clippings, coffee grounds, leaves, all those things. Any comments about adding those things to the garden?
Yeah, I like to excuse me. I like to compost them if possible, like to mix them all in. You like tree leaves, grass clippings, coffee grinds, food waste. Those things are all great amendments, but they're even better when you compost them and they turn into a material that looks much more like soil. So cold composting is a technique where you kind of just throw those things down on the soil, and over time they'll be incorporated. But they do have different properties. And so when you mix them together, you get a better final product. But certainly throwing your coffee grinds out on top of a garden soil is eventually that'll be incorporated in the soil. I just think you're going to have better results if you compost things together.